I inherited my father's cabin and found a journal that revealed he wasn't the man we thought. I spent a year following his secrets and found the truth about our family. When my mother called to tell me Dad was gone, the world felt briefly like a place with a missing clause. It was March. The maple trees outside my apartment still wore a skeleton of brown. I remember the way her voice sounded on the phone, not the ragged sob I'd imagined, but oddly small, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. "He's at peace," she said. "We'll take care of things." We planned a funeral, the kind with coffee and tissue boxes and relatives who hugged as if they could stitch time. People said things like, "He was a good man," with the habitual cadence of eulogy language. And on paper it was true. Hard worker, steady paycheck, weekend projects at the cabin up north that he'd built with his own hands. We always called it the cabin, like it had a proper name of its own. For most of my life it was a refuge, sticky with pine smell, a place for fishing trophies and smoke rings and cheap whiskey. I'd gone there as a kid and come away knowing how to drive a nail, how to gut a fish, how to build a raft out of driftwood. My father taught me those skills with the casual generosity of a man who liked the world to be sturdy. After the funeral, there were the usual things, papers to sign, people from the funeral home who smiled like they'd practiced friendliness in a workshop. My mother, who'd been married to Dad for 37 years, moved slowly through the weeks. She handed me a box one afternoon, not the full inheritance, not yet, just a small thing she'd found in the top of a closet, an old leather journal, brittle at the spine, Dad's initials pressed into the cover with a careful hand. She said, "He kept this for a long time. Thought you might want it." Her voice trembled on the last word in a way that suggested she didn't quite know whether I would want what the pages contained. I took the journal with me in the car, palm flat over the cover as if keeping something steady would keep me steady. I read the first entry that night at my kitchen table, the cat circling my ankles like a sentient cursor. The handwriting was my father's, neat, disciplined, but the voice was different than the man I'd known. The entries were dated backward, like a private chronology of things he didn't want any official record of. They started in 1984 and wound forward through decades, each note small and precise. At first, the journal seemed to be the ordinary stuff. Dreams he had, a list of tools he wanted to replace, a note about a trout that had finally outsmarted him. Then on page 23, there was an entry that flicked a light on in the room. March 3rd, 1991. Today I met her. I didn't intend to. The frost was still in the air and the road turned like the back of a hand. She was by the mailbox, trying to pry the door open of the old Ford. I helped without thinking. She laughed like a bell when the wrench slipped. She said her name was June. I did not tell her I was married. I read it twice, then a third time. The journal was not the kind of secret-keeping thing I expected, a dump of lonely thoughts, but a deliberate archive of an alternate life. Page after page, there were references to someone named June, shared dinners at diners at 2 in the morning, notes about a cabin on the other side of the county, smaller than ours with a strawberry patch, a line that made my stomach contract like a fist. She is my decision that does not have a name I can tell the world. I should have closed the book then. I should have put it back where my mother found it and let the anonymity of death hold the secret tightly like a blanket. Instead, I kept reading. The entries traced an accuracy that was almost clinical. Dates, descriptions, the way June pronounced certain words. There were small, intimate details that matched my father's personhood, his laugh, his stubbornness, but applied to moments I had never known. There were payments recorded, cash withdrawn, and the addresses of P.O. boxes. There were careful recitations of times and places, almost like a ledger for a double life. The first night I slept badly. The next morning I drove up to the cabin with a journal in the glove compartment like contraband. On the way I rehearsed my conversation. I would ask my mother if she'd seen anything, or if she'd known. The rehearsed lines came out hollow. She looked at me with the small, patient sadness of someone confronting an impossible thing already known. "I thought I'd been foolish to suspect," she said finally, "but I always smelled another perfume in the kitchen sometimes. I thought it was my imagination." That afternoon, I drove the logging road on a whim to the property that lay a half-hour past cell service. The sky was a milky white. The air smelled of thawing earth. The cabin looked exactly as it had always looked. Logs dark with age, a porch with a sagging swing, the rusted canoe propped at an angle like a monument. But at the back of the property, tucked behind a line of young pines, was a second footprint, the remains of a garden, path worn down to the mud, and the neat outline of a smaller structure that no one in my family had ever mentioned. A tiny house, perhaps, no more than a shed and a sleeping loft buried in brush. The grass in front was flattened as if someone had been there recently. I found an envelope pinned under a rock with my name on it. Inside was a note written in the same hand as the journal, but different. Not my father's scrupulous block letters, but June's italic hurl. "If you are reading this, then the worst of our lies is exposed. I am so sorry for the ache it causes you. He loved you. Of this I am sure. But he was also someone who needed a place to be other than what the world asked of him. Don't come looking for us. Please." J.I. slid down against the side of the tiny house and let the sky blur. The note was a small, gentle violence, apology folded like a tissue. The fact that someone had thought to pin instructions to a rock spoke to a small compassion and a big fear. She wanted to protect me from something, or she wanted to protect herself from my curiosity. Maybe both. Over the next weeks, I moved like a man walking through molasses. I had trouble at work, dropped emails, and forced a smile at meetings while my mind threaded through scenes. Dinners with my father in a house that was not ours. Furtive envelope exchanges. The way he would stand at the kitchen sink and look like a man dividing himself in two. I started to meet old neighbors, people who had once waved at us on the porch. A retired mail carrier, Agnes, leaned against her fence and said, "I always thought he had a friend in town. He had a laugh he never used on us." She clucked her tongue. Good men are complicated. Eventually, I wrote a letter to June. I slipped it under the rock, hands trembling. I told her I didn't want to hurt her. I wanted to understand. I left my phone number in the letter in ink I intended might smear if the rain came. I waited a week. week. When she called, I almost didn't pick up. She asked if I could meet at noon in a diner in the next town, a place with pale vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never cooled. She arrived with a scarf wrapped like a chapel candle and cheeks the color of bruised peaches. She looked older than the notes had suggested. Time had an effect on everyone, but she still held the same laugh remembered in the margin of my father's writing. Our first conversation was a series of small evasions and then a slow unraveling of fact. She told me she had indeed met my father by the mailbox, exactly as the journal said. They had been in love quietly and for decades. They had a son. He was born in 1993 and had been adopted shortly after birth. My father, June said, had not left his family for her. He had never intended to leave my mother. We were what fit in the margins, she said. A night after the funeral, I found him at the tiny house drinking tea like it was a scripture. He told me he was tired of secrets. He asked me to keep one more. The word son stabbed like an icy needle. June spoke of swaddling, of passing baby clothes through a slit in a screen door, of a woman who had come for a favor and never come back. She said my father had paid for medical bills and school fees in cash, had driven late to drop off library books, had been terrible at gifts but perfect at showing up when it mattered. There was a tenderness in her voice for a man who had been two people in one life, and I wanted to be angry at her tenderness for complicating the public image I'd harbored for 37 years. But I also wanted the same tenderness for myself, the tender attention of a truth delivered without the violence of a secret. June told me the most devastating thing slowly, as if she were setting down a hot pan and naming the burn. My father had not only loved her, he had built a life around her child in a way that was both humane and monstrous. The boy had been adopted by another family in a small town 2 hours away, a family that gave him a stable home and a name that was not his. He was bright, quiet, a kid who loved to draw. My father had never legally created a relationship, had never asked for custody, because my sense of him had been trained by the simple moral grammar of his era. Never destroy another life for your own need. But privately, he had invested in that boy's life as if the child were his blood, and in doing so, he had built a parallel life of footnotes. You should know, June said finally. He wanted you to know before he died. He wanted to tell you about the boy, but he was afraid of breaking the life that protected him. He told me he wanted to leave the journal in the closet for you to find. My heart kept the rhythm of a scratched old record. For weeks, I had the image of a little boy playing with a wooden truck, the image my father would have kept behind his forehead in quiet moments. My anger erupted in a small, sharp way. Why had he not told me? Why had he made the choice to be both a father and not, to bankroll and love and then hide? The ethical calculus of his choices locked itself in my chest like a cold rock. I wanted to find the boy. June wrote me the name of the town and the name on the adoption certificate, the legal name given to the child. I drove there on a weekday, a clutch of hope and fear in the glove compartment. The family who had adopted him were kind and open in an old-fashioned way. They invited me to sit in their living room and drink coffee as if in a small parable. Their son, now 24, was out of the house in class or work. He had grown into a man with my father's cheekbones. There was no DNA test necessary to know the same line of jaw. When we met, it felt like a scene from a film about impossible reconciliations. He came in smiling, a little sheepish. He did not know me. He knew my father as Mr. Reed from an envelope of letters that arrived intermittently on birthdays and reported test scores. An absent grandfather who supplied the occasional computer and paid for lessons, never claiming more than that. We talked. I told him the truth in fragments, careful like someone walking through a plague of glass. He listened without anger. The boy who had been adopted was a man with a practiced steadiness. He'd grown into a kindness that rooted in being loved by people who had chosen him, not in a legal or genetic insistence. There were other discoveries. My father had not only supported that child, but had supported others in small ways. He paid for a neighbor's surgery anonymously, had left cash under the bleachers for a teenager's gym shoes, had wired funds to charities under a name that was not his for fear of attracting attention. The ledger in the journal was not only the accounting of a father's infidelity, it was the accounting of a conscience that felt responsible for the welfare of people beyond his marriage. Learned a strange and painful truth in the months that followed. The secret was not only betrayal, but also bravery. The double life he kept was a kind of covert generosity, a paradoxical architecture where what he withheld publicly from us, he gave privately, in ways that meant the secret's revelation could either harm or mend. My mother, when told, did not explode in fury as I had braced for. She sat with her hands folded like prayer and told me, I always thought there was another name on the wind. The words were simple. There was the crush of human embarrassment, the ache of betrayal, but there was also relief like the release of a muscle. A year went by. I began to understand that secrets are living things. They either rot inside the body that holds them or they get oxygen and sprout new green things. There was a period where I wanted to hate the man in the journal. I wanted to condemn him as a liar. But then one spring afternoon, I found myself driving down to the little town again. I brought the man, my father's other son, into the cabin, and he walked the rooms like an archaeologist who had been given permission to move rubble. When he reached the tiny house behind the pines, he knelt and touched the foundation reverently, like a pilgrim. We did not collapse into sentiment. We had coffee and talked about classes and the way the small town treated charred fall leaves. He asked me about a story my father used to tell about a trout that never bit. I told it, and we both laughed. It was the kind of ordinary thing that felt like radical mercy. My father's choices, hidden, messy, had given me a new family member I did not expect, and that fact was tender and strange. My mother and I had difficult conversations late into the summer. She admitted that she had known a suspicion, and had chosen to live with it because the life they made together was good by the metrics that built their generation. We are not saints, she said. We are just two people who needed to keep going. Her voice had a kind of humility that made me stop wanting dramatic retribution, and instead reach for repair. But repair is not a single gesture. It is a sequence of small decisions that account for the harm. We attended family therapy. It was boring and useful in equal parts, less drama than work. We apologized. We confessed our boredom in marriage and our sorrows. We planted a row of maples behind the tiny house and built a small bench. And then a year after the journal was first found, my mother invited June and the young man for dinner. We sat at the table like a rough council. We talked about continuity and about the weight of secrets. My father, absent now in the person who'd done all the weaving, was present in the stories we told. We buried anger and laughter sometimes. We stopped pretending that betrayal equals death. We admitted instead that betrayal is an injury that sometimes allows for building a new structure if everyone agrees to hold different rooms open. The ending is not tidy. There were people who left us, friends and extended family who thought we had been dishonorable. There were legal tangles over the land and the tiny house. It belonged to my father in all legal ways, but June had tilled a patch of strawberries and had a claim, not in law, but in labor. We paid some debts out of the inheritance, and we bought the boy, my brother, some tools for an apprenticeship he cherished. We tried to do right by the people who had been collateral damage in a private experiment of a man who wanted to be both faithful and free. What I learned, in the slow, granular way of time, was that people are not monolithic. My father was many things: teller of jokes, builder of porches, an unreliable husband, and a reliable giver. June was a woman who loved in ways that required privacy and who had carved a life out of the margins. My mother was both forgiving and hurt, as all long-married people are. I learned that love is recursive. It returns in patterns that look like both punishment and mercy. The journal stayed with me for a long time. Then it went back to the closet where my father had kept it. On bad days, I would take it down and read a line about a trout, or a meticulous note about which screw went where, and it would calm me like a prayer. Once by myself, I walked to the little house behind the pines and sat on its steps while dust went blue. I thought about secrets as seeds. I thought about the boy who had become my brother, who now sometimes helped me repair the dock, and who sometimes came to my mother's for dinner to listen to stories about a man whose life had been divided in two. When people ask me if I forgave my father, I tell them it is complicated. Forgiveness is not a place, it is a labor. I forgave parts of him, and I grieved other parts. I forgave the man who built things and the man who hid them, and I grieved the brokenness inflicted on the people around him. The journal taught me that people make monstrous choices sometimes out of the strangest motives: love, fear, cowardice, generosity, all braided together. If there's a final thing to say, it's that truth gives you a complicated kind of freedom. When a secret is unearthed, you have to decide what to do next: yell, forgive, run, live with the damage, or try to rebuild. I chose the slow, awkward work of rebuilding, not because it erased the hurt, but because it honored the parts of my father that were also human. And somewhere behind the pines, a little house stands as an imperfect testament to the messy ways people try to love. The end.